On behalf of the entire history department, I want to welcome you all to what I think is going to be a tremendously impactful assembly. As of May 8th, we will be 74 years from the end of World War II on the on the European front. And as the years go on, there are less and less people around to bear witness to the horrible atrocities of the Holocaust and World War II. So I first want to thank Judy Bond for affording us this opportunity, and I'd now like to introduce to you, it is my honor to introduce to you Mr. George Elbaum.
Thank you for the introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad you're all awake. I'd like to tell you about the world that I was born into, a dangerous world that I survived, but only because of major luck, and a world that I hope none of you ever have to experience. The place, Warsaw, Poland. The time, September 1939. Hitler's armies invade Poland, and that starts World War II. With hundreds of airplanes, thousands of tanks, 1 million troops, the Nazi army sweeps across Poland and conquers it in 1 month. Then they hold a victory parade on the streets of Warsaw, and even Hitler himself comes to view it. That's Hitler with his arm outstretched. I was born there. I lived there at that time in Warsaw, but I don't remember this because I was only 1 year old. But I remember most things since I was 3. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, I had a family of 12 people. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. Within 3 years, out of that 12 people, only my mother and I were still alive. The other 10 were all dead, murdered by the Nazis. Why? Because they were Jewish. As you probably know by now, the stated goal of the Nazi Party was to exterminate everyone who they considered undesirable. Jews were on top of that list, but there were others, gypsies, gays, invalids, socialists. But Jews were on top of the list and the largest group. And at that time, when Hitler invaded Poland, there was about 3.5 million Jews living in the country. By the end of the war, 5 years later, 90% of them, 9 out of every 10 were dead, murdered by the Nazis. What became known as the Holocaust was the murder by the Nazis of about 6 million Jews during the 5 years of the war. Now, 6 million is a huge number. I don't feel it, and I don't think anyone can really feel what is the meaning of 6 million. So I'd like to put it into more human terms. And for the moment, let's talk about just averages, okay? I'm trying to find a number here, and then maybe, okay, I'll tell you what the number is in a minute. There we go, okay. On the average, if you say 6 million were murdered in 5 years, that averages to 1,200,000 per year or 100,000 every month. That's still a huge number that I don't feel. But if you consider the population of Boston itself, that's what I was looking for. Boston, when I looked this up, was 617,000. So let's say 600,000 on the average. So at the average rate of 100,000 Jews killed every month, that means the Nazis killed as many Jews as every person, every man, woman, and child living in Boston every 6 months. Think of that. Every person in Boston killed every 6 months. Or during the 5 years of the war, essentially the Nazis killed as many Jews as 10 cities the size of Boston. Men, women, and children. No battle casualties in that number. There's never been murder on that scale in the history of the world. Even Genghis Khan wasn't a murderer to that extent. So you can ask yourself, well, why? Why did they do it? What was the reason? The answer is anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews. But anti-Semitism is just like all the other antis, whether it's anti-Christian, anti-Muslim, anti-black, anti-white, anti-gay, anti-straight. It's hatred, not for someone, not because they've ever done anything to you, but because they're different. Maybe a different color skin, maybe a different way of worshiping God. That's all the difference. And that's the cause of anti-Semitism or any of the other antis. And all the antis, all of them, are nothing, that's only totally, totally negative. And they always, always lead to destruction. Try to remember this. In your life, if you ever expect to do anything good, you have to be for something, not against something. Don't be anti, be for things. Try to remember that as you go through life. In addition to the cruelty and inhumanity of murder on that industrial scale, I call that industrial scale, like a mass production murder machine that the Nazis came up with. Well, how is it possible to do that? How do you create a machine that kills on the average 100,000 young, middle-aged, old civilians every month? And actually, at the height of the killing, which was like late 42, early 43, the Nazis were putting through about 250,000 Jews through the gas chambers every month. How did they do this? Well, they're very efficient, at least when it came to the process of murder. And the way they did it is in each of the countries they conquered, they chose 1 or 2 or 3 major cities where a lot of Jews were already living. And in those cities, they focused on the Jewish neighborhood and took a small part of it. Like in Warsaw, they took 2% of the total area of Warsaw. And I'll be speaking about Warsaw. I lived there at that time. I remember that. So they took a very small part of Warsaw, 2%, even though the Jewish population of Warsaw was 30%. And once they decided which 2% they took, was kind of the heart of the Jewish neighborhood, they built a wall around it. A brick wall with barbed wire on top, with gates that were guarded by soldiers with dogs and machine guns. And once the wall was up, they collected Jews throughout the whole Warsaw city, and like 80-90% of them live outside those small 2% that was walled in. And the walled in area became known as the Ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto, and that's where my family lived. So once the wall was established, they swept the rest of the city and collected the 80 or 90% of Jews that lived outside the wall, and they forced them into the ghetto. And then they swept the rest of the countryside, the smaller towns and villages throughout the whole Warsaw region, collected all the Jews from the whole region and forced them into the ghetto. So think about it. Imagine, for example, you take Boston, 617,000. What if you chose an area within the heart of Boston, 24 blocks, 36 blocks, where there's 100,000 people living in it, and you build a wall around it? So there's 100,000 people living in the area of Boston you just walled in, and there's 500,000 people living outside. What would happen if you forced those 500,000 that live outside the wall into the walled-in area? Where would they stay? Where would they, there's only room for the people already living there. That's exactly what happened in Warsaw, exactly. And I remember when I was, about 3 years old, suddenly there's like a dozen strangers moved into the apartment, our apartment, which at that time, only my mother, my grandmother, and I were there. The men, like my grandfather and my uncle, they've already been taken away by the Nazis. They were all dead by then, but we didn't know about it until after the war. So these strangers, they were sleeping on the couches, on the floor, in the kitchen, in the hallway. And I remember asking my mom, who are these people? What are they doing here? And my mom said, well, they're friends. They'll be with us for a little while. And they were with us for a little while, whatever that might mean to a 3-year-old. But once the Nazis were satisfied that they collected Jews from the whole Warsaw region and forced them into the ghetto, they started taking people out of there, putting them on trains and sending them to concentration camps, and most of them to the gas chambers. There we go. Oops. I guess I must have pressed it too many times. How do I get this back? Yeah. Okay. Oh, I guess, never mind. Okay, good. I'll move it forward then, okay. This is a scene that I remember. But how did the Nazis organize this? I'll read to you from a short chapter from a book that I wrote, 9 years ago. The book is called Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows. And if we have time, I'll tell you that my writing, it was inspired by a small middle school in a small town in Tennessee. I've never been there, never met anybody from there, but they inspired me to write this book after I was silent about my Holocaust childhood for some 65 years. This chapter is called Umschlagplatz, which in German means shipping point or collection point. Now, I do not speak German. I never did. And the first time I heard the word Umschlagplatz was when I was 4 years old. I'm 80 right now, so that was 76 years ago. I've never forgotten that word, Umschlagplatz. Suddenly there was loud shouting coming from the courtyard. Then the entire apartment complex was filled with ear-splitting noise. Shouts, screams, doors banging everywhere, and heavy running footsteps. My grandmother ran into the room holding my coat, grabbed my hand, and led me to the staircase, which was filled with people, all going downstairs. When we reached the courtyard, it was already full of people, crowded together in groups, with soldiers in dark green uniforms, shouting orders and walking between the groups. My grandmother held my hand tightly as we were pushed back and forth by the crowd, till finally we were standing at the edge of our group, facing the large arched entry gate that led from the street into our courtyard. It seemed that we stood there a long, long time, and I recall being glad that my grandmother put my coat on me because I was getting cold. And I remember seeing some groups being led by soldiers out of the courtyard through the big gate. Exactly what you see there. See the big gate in the back? These people are being led out and they're guarded by soldiers with machine guns. That's a scene I remember from the other side. Then suddenly I saw my mother running in through the gate, holding a piece of paper in her hand, showing the paper to some soldiers, talking with them, and finally coming to us, to my grandmother and me, and leading us out of the courtyard. It was only years later, after the war, did I understand what happened. The Nazis were emptying out Warsaw Ghetto, apartment block at a time, and shipping the residents to concentration camps. My mother, who at that time was working in a factory in the ghetto, which the Nazis authorized the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee to manage and make uniforms for the Nazi army, my mother somehow learned that our apartment block was being emptied out that day. And she got from her factory director an official document allowing her to keep her family in place. With this document, in effect, a temporary permit to continue living. Think about that. That little piece of paper was a temporary permit for my grandmother and me to continue living. With this permit, she managed to convince the Nazi officer commanding that day's sweep to let us go. Had she arrived a few minutes later, it would have been too late. Because if my mom had arrived a few minutes later, my fate would have been like this little boy. Because he lived maybe a week or two longer after this photo was taken. Because from here, these people were taken to freight yards, put onto freight cars, cattle cars, and shipped directly to concentration camps. And all children, most women, and all the older or weaker men would be almost immediately sent to the gas chambers. So if my mom had come a few minutes later, I would not be here with you guys today. Pure luck. Pure luck. What happened next? Yeah, okay. My mom was a very smart woman. She realized sooner than most people within the ghetto, she realized that the days of the ghetto and everybody in it were numbered. So she decided to try to get us to safety while there was still a chance. And the first place in our flight to safety was a place I called the shed. And the reason, and this is a scene from the shed that I remember, I was at that time 3.5 or 4 years old. And the reason I put it on the cover of my book is because that scene had a major effect on my adult life, my professional life. So I read to you the short chapter called The Shed. We could only speak in whispers here, my grandmother told me. We were now in a large shed with corrugated metal walls and ceiling, pieces of rusting metal equipment strewn about, and our bags and blankets on the floor. Several families were here with us, no one that I recognized, all with bags and suitcases and blankets. One family even had a little black dachshund, and its owners told us that it never barks. I petted his soft fur and I played with him. Some of the people played cards, some knitted, but no one spoke except in very quiet whispers. My grandmother took some bread and sausage from her bag, made tea on a small chemical burner, and that was our dinner. When it got dark, no one lit any candles. We wrapped ourselves in our blankets and we slept. I woke up in the morning and I wanted to play with the little black dachshund, but it was gone. I asked its owners, where is it? And their only answer to me was, it's gone. Years later, my mom told me that during the night, its owners had to choke it to death to keep it from barking at footsteps outside the shed. If you guys have a small pet, like a small dog or a small cat, can you imagine choking it to death in your own lap? I can't. I can't. That day, or perhaps many days, went by very slowly in the near silence, the only sounds coming from outside the shed. There was a big hole in the shed's roof through which I watched white clouds on the blue sky. Once I saw an airplane with black crosses on its wings flying across the sky, exactly what you see there. That is a scene that I remember. At that time, I didn't know that it was a Nazi airplane, and the black crosses were Nazi insignia. It just looked so beautiful to me. It wasn't constrained in a dark shed as I was, and I felt strangely drawn to it. I wanted to be in it. I wanted to be somehow with it. I never lost that feeling and interest in airplanes. A few years later, after the war, I would read Polish aviation magazines. Then later on, after we came to America and lived in Oregon, I went to high school there, I would build and fly model airplanes. In college, I majored in aeronautical engineering, worked in the aerospace industry. I took flying lessons and got a private pilot's license, crashed an airplane and walked away from it without a scratch. Pure luck. And then for 20-some years, I flew hang gliders in Southern California. Crashed maybe half a dozen times. Walked away from all of them except the very last one. And on that one, I crashed near the top of a fairly steep mountain. And for my next birthday present, my wife gave me a video taken from a newsreel helicopter showing a rescue helicopter lifting me unconscious from the top of the hill. That was my birthday present, and my wife makes me watch it whenever I get too cocky. However, I've never forgotten that airplane against the blue sky through the hole in the roof and the feeling of awe and exhilaration that it gave me. And that's why I put it on the cover of my book. What happened next? My mom put my grandmother into what she thought was a safe hiding place, and she paid a lot of money, almost everything she had, to put my grandmother into that safe hiding place. Turns out it wasn't, but we only learned that after the war. But thinking that my grandmother would be safe through the rest of the war, my mom smuggled herself and me out of the ghetto. What happened in the ghetto after we left? Several months later, I don't know how many, because I was at that time, 4 years old, 3.5, 4. Enough information, including some eyewitnesses, managed to smuggle themselves back into the ghetto and told all the residents, all the remaining residents, what was happening with the people that were being shipped out, that most of them were going to their death in the gas chambers. So a group of young civilians, some your age, some a little bit older, so it's late teens, 20s, 30s, several hundred of them. They knew they would all die, but they decided to die fighting rather than die in the gas chambers. And they staged what became known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now think about it. A group of young civilians, 400 or 500, no military training. They had some rifles and some pistols hidden in the ghetto. They rose up against a trained Nazi army of thousands of soldiers with tanks and artillery and airplanes. The ghetto fighters knew they had no chance. They knew they would all die. It was a hopeless, hopeless act of defiance. And they fought for about 2-3 weeks, and they all died. This is a scene from the ghetto at the end of the uprising. Every man, woman, and child that remained in the ghetto was dead, every one of them. What I forgot to tell you is that, when I said that people were lucky, they were when they were forced into the ghetto, they would live with friends or relatives, like the people that moved in with us. Well, what if they weren't lucky? What if they didn't know anybody? They'd have to live on the street. And Warsaw is a northern city, like Boston, like Toronto, like New York, like Seattle. It's not a good place to be living on the street in Boston, is it? Because of that, during the 2.5 years of the ghetto's existence, 80,000 people died within its walls, many of them right on the street. And what I remember is, particularly in the winter, in winter mornings, I would hear a clang, clang, clang of a big wooden wagon that was pulled by men over the cobblestone streets of the ghetto, making the clang, clang, clang noise. These men were collecting bodies of people who had died during the night on the street and taking them out of the ghetto. The ghetto was not a good place to live, was not a good place to die. And this is a photo of a couple of kids begging for food, starving. There was no food to be given. We were all hungry. We were all starving. Yeah. What happened at the ghetto after those 2-3 weeks? Every man, woman, and child was dead. And this is a photo, a panoramic photo of the ghetto right after the uprising was ended. Hitler apparently was so furious that the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto dared to rise up against him that he ordered his army to destroy every building within the ghetto. What you see there is a panoramic shot of the ghetto. The black line back there, those are the walls. These are the buildings of Warsaw right outside the walls of the ghetto. Nothing was touched outside the walls of the ghetto, but every building within the ghetto was destroyed because Hitler was personally insulted about the uprising. Now, how did my mom and I survive outside the ghetto? Here's a photo of my mom with her brother when she's 7 years old. She was a very smart woman. She was a young attorney before the war. In college, she learned English and she learned French. So when she got herself and me out of the ghetto, the first thing she did was to dye her black hair blonde so she wouldn't look quite so Jewish. The next, what she did was she bought the identification papers of a young Polish Catholic woman, and she took on that woman's name, and that woman's name was Śliwowska. Anything with the SKI is considered a Polish Catholic name, and Elbaum was considered a Jewish name. So my mom took on this woman's name. And every time, the next time my mom saw me, which was probably several weeks later, because I didn't live with her once we were out of the ghetto, my mom told me, from now on, forget Elbaum. Your name is no longer Elbaum, it's Śliwowski. You better remember that. And I had about 4 or 5 different Polish Catholic last names, because every time my mom would buy for herself a new set of fake ID papers with a Polish Catholic last name. Next time she saw me, she would tell me what that name was, and I had to remember it. So with fake ID papers, with blonde hair, my mom went to work. First, she had some good jobs because she knew English and she knew French. She became an English governess or French governess to wealthy Poles who wanted their kids to learn those languages. When those good jobs ended, my mom took whatever was available, whatever. And she became a cook. I learned after the war she was not a good cook. It kept me thin. But she became a cook, a maid, a scrub woman, a laundress. She took on whatever was available, as long as the job came with 2 benefits. Benefit number 1, room and board, either in the apartment or the apartment block of the people who hired her. And the reason that was critical is that she wouldn't have to walk to work on the street back and forth every day. Because every time she was on the street, she could be picked up by Nazi patrol or police and sent to concentration camp. Requirement number 2, a little bit of cash. Not because she needed it, because she was getting room and board, but to pay to the people who were keeping me. Because my mom realized or decided that I would be safer if I was raised by Polish Catholic families together with their kids. My mom tells me that when I was 4 and 5 and 6 years old, my hair was light brown, so I didn't look Jewish. It was only right after the war, in 45 and 46, when within a year my hair went from light brown to dark brown to black like hers. And then about 10, 15 years ago, it turned light again. You guys know how that happens, eh? If you don't, ask your grandparents. It's going to happen to all of you guys too. So, anyway, so my mom survived by luck, strength, and wits. I survived by luck only, and I'll give you an example of my luck. With perhaps the first or one of the first families with whom I lived. I remember I was sitting at a table eating soup, and it must have been evening because I remember somebody was lighting a kerosene lamp on the table. There was no electricity in that part of Warsaw apparently at that time. So I'm sitting there eating soup, and suddenly there was loud banging on the front door and loud shouts in German. And everybody rushed to the front door, but I didn't. I continued to sit there and eat soup. Why? Probably because I was hungry. I was hungry through most of the war years, but that was not unusual. There was not enough food in Poland, and a lot of people were hungry at least some of the time. And I was hungry most of the time. So I'm sitting there eating soup, ignoring what's going on at the front door, till all of a sudden I sensed somebody was staring at me. And I remember turning to the side, and there stood this tall Nazi soldier, and he was staring straight down at me. I remember he had on this heavy dark green coat, so it must have been winter time. And on his shoulder he had this very, very large weapon, rifle. It's kind of like it was a weapon, but it was like a much bigger barrel than a rifle and big holes around it. I've never seen a weapon like that. So I kept staring at it. It just fascinated me. And apparently that's probably why I became an engineer eventually, because machinery fascinated me even when I was 4 years old. I just kept staring at his gun. And finally I looked at him and I smiled at him. I still remember that. I smiled at him. I don't know why, but I smiled at him, and then I continued to eat soup and ignored him. He stood there another moment or two, trying to decide probably what to do about me. And then he decided to walk off. He decided just to leave things alone. He walked off, and soon he and the other soldiers were gone from the apartment, and all was quiet. I learned after the war that had I shown any fear whatsoever, he would have made me drop my pants to see whether I was circumcised, because only Jews were circumcised in Poland at that time. And if that had happened, I would have never reached my 5th birthday. Again, pure luck. I lived with about 4 or 5 different Polish Catholic families during the war. And my mom would move me from one to the next whenever the family with whom I was living alerted her to danger. Danger to me and danger to them. And the reason for that was that of all the countries that the Nazis conquered, only in Poland they made a decree that any Polish family caught hiding Jews, including little kids like me, would be immediately sent to the concentration camps along with the Jews they were hiding. So I want to ask you a challenge question, and I'd like you to think about it. Please think about it seriously, and please answer it honestly, but answer it only to yourself, to nobody else. Answer it from the bottom of your heart. Imagine that's now 20 years in the future. You guys are finished with your education. You're working for some company here in Boston area. And the company gives you a promotion, but it will be at their foreign office or foreign factory. And when you get there, you're going to have an apartment or a house. Everything's to be taken care of. You'll be there for a year. It's a promotion, so it's a good one. And when you get there, you find out that the government of that country is prejudiced. They're prejudiced against a small minority. They're arresting them, they're throwing them in jails, they're beating them, they're killing them. And you know that they're innocent, just the government is prejudiced. And you know that you could save one of them. Imagine you could save a little 4-year-old undernourished kid, as I was, a little kid like that. If you took that little kid into your house or apartment, but you might be risking maybe your life. Would you do it? Would you do it? Think about it. But answer it only to yourself. But the 4 or 5 different families that took me in, they took that risk. They saved me. And again, that's the only reason I'm with you guys here today, because they took that risk. They took that risk. The last family with whom I lived was headed by a man named Leon. His is the only name I remember, only his first name, not his last name. And I don't remember the names of any of the other families. Probably because I liked him. He was always fair to me. And he was kind most of the time, not all the time, because he was also very tough. When I did something I wasn't supposed to do, like when I disobeyed him, and that included, for example, when I ate some food that I wasn't supposed to touch when I was alone in the apartment, he beat me, and he beat me hard. He had a black belt, and he beat the hell out of me sometimes. But I always knew why he was doing it. I knew what I had done to disobey him, and if it involved eating food because I was really hungry, sometimes it was even worth a beating. So I still liked Leon. I didn't like his wife or their little daughter, maybe a year younger than I, because whenever my mom would visit me, that might be once a month, once every several months. The last time it was 6 months I didn't see her. My mom would bring me a present. It might be a little wooden toy to play with, or it might be a hard-boiled egg, which was a nice present in wartime Poland when everybody was hungry. My mom always made sure that I ate the egg while she was there. She wanted to make sure I got the egg, so she watched me eat it every time. But after my mom would leave, Leon's wife very often took away the little wooden toy that my mom brought me and gave it to their little daughter to play with. So I didn't like them. I was with Leon from beginning of 1944 through the end of the year. That included August 44, time of the Warsaw Uprising. Now, the Warsaw Uprising differed in one very fundamental way from the Ghetto Uprising. In the Ghetto Uprising, the fighters knew they would all die. It was truly a hopeless act of defiance. The Warsaw fighters of August 44, so that was 16 months after the April 43 Ghetto Uprising, so 16 months later, the Warsaw fighters thought they had a chance of winning. First of all, there was like 20,000 of them, and they were loyal to and supported by the Polish government in exile in London. So they had some weapons, mortars, machine guns, relatively lightweight stuff that was parachuted down to them from London by the Royal Air Force. But the main reason the Warsaw fighters thought they had the chance is by August 44, by that time, the Russian army had pushed the Nazis out of Russia and out of eastern Poland, and the Russian army was sitting right at the edge of the river that cuts through Warsaw. So the hope was that once the uprising started, the Russian army would cross the river, help the fighters liberate Warsaw sooner, liberate Poland sooner, end the war sooner. And as a matter of fact, Moscow radio encouraged the fighters to start the uprising. So everybody expected that once the uprising started, the Russian army would cross the river and help. Well, that was a huge fake out, a huge lie on the part of the Russians. They had no intention of helping, because Russians by that time decided that every country they liberate from the Nazis, they would turn it into a communist satellite. So the last thing they wanted in Poland, for example, would be to have a Polish underground, still loyal to the pro-Western government in London, still armed, alive, resisting the communist takeover. So the Russian army did absolutely nothing. And for the 3 or 4 months of the Warsaw Uprising, they sat across the river and waited and waited. And they watched while the Nazis wiped out most of the 20,000 Polish fighters and turned Warsaw into a total ruin. This is what Warsaw looked like at the end of the uprising. Every building was in ruins. How did Leon and his family and I get out of there? I'll read to you a chapter called August 44, Warsaw Uprising, or at least part of the chapter. My first awareness of the impending catastrophe started one day while standing at the window, watching the summer from a distance. I say that because I was never allowed to go out on the street, both for my safety and the safety of the family keeping me. Suddenly, there was loud shouting on the street, and people were running, and shots, many shots. Leon ran to the window, looked outside, and as bullets began to hit our building, he grabbed me and ran back into the room, away from the window. For some reason, most likely ignorance, I didn't feel frightened at that moment, and soon all was quiet. As Leon and his wife talked in very agitated voices, I remained unconcerned and totally oblivious of the danger. Sometimes ignorance can be bliss, and ignorance saved me a number of times during the war. The next afternoon, we heard distant gunfire, and Leon's wife was packing suitcases and cardboard boxes. The next morning, we all carried these downstairs and loaded them on a pedal-powered rickshaw, which is like a cart with a bicycle wheel on each side and a bicycle rear end on the back. So Leon had obtained this rickshaw somewhere, and with him pedaling and his wife and daughter and I sitting on the baggage, we left the city. The Warsaw Uprising had just started. I remember nothing by the ride through the city, but once we reached the countryside, there were fields of grain gleaming in the sun, farmhouses with thick thatched roofs, cows and goats in the pasture, and occasionally people working in the fields or walking along the road. It was quiet, except for Leon's pedaling and heavy breathing and the rickshaw creaking. Eventually, we stopped to rest along the side of the road, and I asked Leon where we were going. To my cousin's farm, he answered. I wandered away along a ditch that ran beside the road, and then I noticed a dark blue object, like a large potato lying in the grass, something about this size, dark blue. I picked it up. It felt heavy and cold like metal, and had a shiny ring on one end of it. I started to play with it, pulled on the ring, and it came out in my hand, just as Leon called that we were leaving. I tossed the object over my shoulder, like this. Because I was standing right at the edge of the ditch, it fell into the ditch, apparently. And I tossed the object over my shoulder, and then I ran to the rickshaw. As I scampered onto it, there was a very loud bang coming from where I had just been. We all gasped, and Leon started pedaling furiously, much faster than before. It was only later, much later, that I understood that the dark blue object was a German hand grenade. And while Leon didn't know what I had done, he did know that with the uprising now in Warsaw, any Poles found by the Nazis near weapons or explosives would have been shot on the spot. So double luck. If Leon had called me a few seconds later, the grenade would have exploded in my hand. And if there had been any Nazi troops in the vicinity and heard the explosion, they would have tried to find us. And if they did find us, they would have shot us all. So double luck. I was with Leon and his family on that farm through the end of that year into January. I remember going Christmas caroling with them at that Christmas. And then right after New Year's, I remember right after New Year's, my mom appeared. I don't know how she found me. There was certainly no communication of any sort, no post office, no telephones right after the uprising, so I had no idea how she found me. But it's one of those questions that occurred to me when I was writing the book, and I never asked her. My mom died, 15 years ago at the age of 91. I wrote the book 9 years ago, so I had plenty of time as an adult to ask her questions. I never did. I don't know why. Anyway, I was very happy to see her, obviously. I had not seen her for 6 months, so I didn't know when I would see her or even whether I would ever see her again. So it was a very happy moment for me. About a week or two later, afterwards, I was sleeping. My mom shook me awake, woke me up, and she had tears in her eyes. And she said to me, "You're saved." And I didn't know what she meant. But she took my hand and pulled me out of bed. I was half asleep, and she was dragging me behind her. And we were passing by a window that faced the front of the house. There in the darkness on the snow was this huge black shape with headlights on it. And it looked like a tank. And when we came into the main room, there were soldiers there, but they didn't have the dark green uniforms of the Nazis. They had olive uniforms. My mom bent down to me and said, "They're Russian." When the Russian tank commander saw me, I was the only little kid in the room. He reached into his pocket and took out a little white cube like this, and he handed it to me like this. But I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "That's sugar, take it, taste it." So I put it in my mouth, and I swear it is the best taste I have ever had my whole life to this moment. And ever since that moment, which I call the sugar cube miracle, I have a tremendous sweet tooth. I can start dinner with dessert, have dessert for the main course, and end it with dessert. And I'd love to do it occasionally, but my wife never lets me. I mean, I know she's right, but I love to do it. Yeah, it's bad. About a week or two after the sugar cube miracle, we learned that the Russian army had pushed the Nazis out of Warsaw. So my mom and I returned to Warsaw, mostly walking, occasionally succeeding to, we're trying to get hitching rides on military trucks. Okay, occasionally we get a ride, but most we walked the whole day. And when we came to Warsaw, it looked like this, except there was a lot of snow. In addition to all the ruins, here and there, here and there would be a body or two half buried in the snow, still left over from the battle between the Russian army and the Nazis. My mom very quickly got a place for us, the two of us, to sleep over on the other side of the river, where the Russian army had encamped, which wasn't touched. And she very quickly got a job, a very good job, because she had been an attorney before the war. She got a job with a brand new book publishing organization which the communist government started to print books and propaganda. And her job was to go around the country and set up bookstores, because during the war most of the bookstores in Poland were closed. In order to get around the country, to go to some of the further out cities, she would need transport. Public transport was very unreliable or non-existent, so she was given a car and a driver. It was sort of a car. It was a little pre-war three-wheeler, one little tiny wheel about this size in the front, two little wheels in the back. It was rickety, it was noisy, it was smelly, it was always breaking down. My mom didn't drive, so her driver was always fixing it. Her driver was given a machine gun, and my mom was given a pistol. Why? Because whereas in the Warsaw region, the Nazis had wiped out most of the pro-Western underground and left Warsaw in total ruins, my mom and her driver needed to go to some of the further out cities where there were still pockets of pro-Western underground resisting the communist takeover. And they knew that only the government owned cars, so they would attack cars on the road. I guess this three-wheeler was so pathetic that if they ever saw it, they realized it wasn't worth attacking. Nobody important would be in a little car like that. This is a photo of my mom and me in the summer of 1945. We're now in a Jeep, which means that the little three-wheeler must have died. So I'll read to you a chapter called Summer 1945, Returning Prisoners, Falling Stars. Several times during those early months after the war, my mom and I went to the railroad station on news of trains arriving from Russia, carrying Polish prisoners from the Eastern Front. My father, a reserve officer, before the war was called to active duty during the war's first few days, and he was sent to the Eastern Front. And my mom had hoped that he had been taken prisoner and would be returning from Russia on one of these trains. My mother was understandably filled with hope and anticipation as we waited for these trains to arrive at the station. But for me, it was a strange and an unsettling mix of expectation and concern. On the one hand, I wanted a father in my life, and I quietly was envious of children who had one, like Leon's daughter. On the other hand, I had no memories of my own father, as I was only 1 year old when he left for the front and never returned. So the train for which we were waiting might bring a total stranger into our life. And I could only hope that he would like me and that I would like him. Together with a lot of other people, we would stand and watch at the station's entrance as the gaunt and bedraggled men filed out slowly and wearily. They were gaunt and bedraggled because they were prisoners in Russia for years. Sometimes there were joyous shouts as the waiting and hopeful spotted one of their own, followed by much embracing and tears of happiness. Mostly, however, the arriving men shuffled by ungreeted, perhaps because they were not from Warsaw and had to travel further to find their families, or perhaps because there were no survivors in their families to greet them. My mother was always quiet when we left the station after finding no one. We would walk home in total silence. One evening that August, my mom and I were riding in a car on the pontoon bridge which the army built across the Wisła River. It was a clear night, and the whole starry sky was visible across the open expanse of water. However, unlike most nights, the sky was full of falling stars. It looked like it was raining stars, like the whole sky was falling. Then I recalled an old Polish superstition that each falling star signifies someone's death. And I wondered whether these hundreds and thousands of falling stars represented those who had died during the war, and perhaps one of those stars was my father's. Since then, I've happened to be a few times in the mountains or the desert on a clear night in August during the Perseid star shower. And I'm always struck by the difference in my circumstances and conditions then and now, and how lucky I am for that difference. I'm very lucky. That was a very happy time for me, because I thought that my mom would never again park me with some strangers as she had done several times during the war. But that's not what happened. 2 years after the war ended, so it was early 1947, the war ended in Poland in January of 45, so it was like maybe January or February of 47. I was on a train with a group of other Jewish orphans or half-orphans. We were going by train to France, and then from France we would board ship and sail to Palestine. Not Israel, because Israel wasn't formed yet for another year or so, year and a half. Why was my mom doing this? I presume it was for my safety, because I thought she probably, well, I'll tell you what was happening. During those 2 years, there were pogroms throughout many of the smaller towns and villages in Poland. By pogroms, I mean when mobs of angry anti-Semitic Poles would seek out any Jews that survived in their town, drag them out on the street, beat them, kill them. Several hundred Jews were beaten to death by Polish mobs. And here's the paradox. During the war, many Polish families saved Jews like me at the risk of their own lives. And the Jews that were being beaten by the Polish mobs were alive only because Polish families saved them. But then other Poles, angry anti-Semitic, beat them to death. That makes no sense. Why some Poles saved Jews during the war and others killed the same survivors? It's a paradox, but there's one answer only. As we grow into adulthood, we have a choice. Do we lead our life by what we were taught as right and fair and just? Or do we let anger and hate and violence lead our lives? We all have that choice, and you guys will too. You guys will too. I would probably be living in Israel right now, and I would have gone with this group to Palestine had it not been for an accident. One evening after dinner, when we were in France, several of us were roughhousing, chasing each other. I was running, tripped, fell. I had this tremendous pain in my leg. Did I move this? No, good. I had tremendous pain in my leg. And as I was lying there on the floor crying, one of the adults came over, I was at that time 8 years old. He came over and started to pick my leg up, and I screamed with pain. And I remember he said to somebody, I think his leg is broken. We better take him to the hospital tomorrow. But that doesn't sound serious to you or to me now. But at that moment, it was very serious to me. Because right after the war, I saw so many people without arms or legs that I just assumed that if you break one, that they cut it off. I mean, I was sure of it. And when one of the kids with whom I was playing came over and knelt down beside me and said, hey, don't worry, you'll be playing soccer with us tomorrow. I thought, how am I ever going to play soccer? I'm going to spend the rest of my life on one leg. I obviously didn't sleep very well that night. The next morning, they took me to the hospital, and when they were putting a cast on my leg, hip to toe, I asked the man that took me there, I said, why do they bother doing this? They're just going to cut my leg off. He laughed at me and said, no, don't worry, I'm going to cut your leg off. A couple of months, they'll take off this cast, you'll be as good as new. I was one very happy little 8-year-old at that point. They sent me back to my mom in Warsaw. The rest of the camp went off to Palestine. But, oh yeah, this is my passport photo when I was 8 years old for the trip to France and then on to Palestine. So when the camp went off to Palestine, they sent me back to my mom in Warsaw. But 2 years later, early 1949. I'm back in Paris with my mom. This is summer 1949. So that summer I turned 11. How did that happen? My mom did such a good job setting up bookstores throughout Poland that the Polish communist government decided to send her to France to set up Polish bookstores for the Polish immigrant community in France to try to entice them to come back. However, when a communist government sent anybody to the West, they always kept somebody in the family, somebody close in the family, back in the country, like in Poland, kind of like a hostage, to make sure the person going to the West doesn't defect. Well, there was nobody left there alive in our family with whom my mom could leave me. So the government had a choice, send both of us in either. They decided to take the risk and they sent both of us. And for the first 6 or some months, my mom set up a number of bookstores, Polish bookstores in France. But eventually, that summer, she defected, went to the American embassy, applied for a visa for herself and for me. Her visa came through very quickly. And in September, my mom came to the United States. My visa didn't. So once again, my mom had to part me with a couple of strangers. It was a Polish-French couple in Paris. I lived with them for several months. During that time, during the days, I would wander all around Paris, walk everywhere, ride the metro, got to know Paris like a palm of my hand. Learned enough French, just picked it up. So street French, not good French, but street French. But I spoke well enough so that whenever I got lost, I could ask somebody in French, how do I get home? They would tell me and I got home. So it always worked. But eventually my visa came through, and I think at 1st December 1949, this Polish-French couple put me on an airplane in Paris. My mom met me in New York. We spent about a week or two in New York. It was like, probably like middle to late December. And then we took a train down to a little town in North Carolina called Cove City, 1,000 population, tiny place. And my mom and I took the train there. And this was like middle or late December. In January, first week of January, when school opened, my mom right away put me into school. I had been in 5th grade before in Poland, so she put me into 6th grade. Now, the only issue was I didn't speak a word of English. And nobody there spoke Polish. Or is it the other way around? Yeah, that's the way, okay. Sometimes I get it mixed up. Anyway, my mom thought it'd be the best way for me to quickly learn how to speak English if I had to, because nobody spoke Polish. She was right. By the time we left, my mom and I left like a year and a half later, so it was, in the summer of 1950, so 51, summer of 51, we left and went to Oregon. By that time, I was already fluent in English. First of all, learning English was not that easy. And at the very beginning, when I didn't speak a word of English, I made some very, very embarrassing mistakes. And if we have time, ask me about when they tried to teach me baseball. That was probably the most embarrassing of all. But I kept making them, and afterwards I can laugh at them, but they were embarrassing. The part that's interesting to me is that everybody there had a heavy Southern accent. I learned English from them. I didn't pick up the accent. I don't know why. My only explanation for myself is that my Polish accent was so heavy that it kept the Southern accent away. That's my explanation. After a year and a half, my mom and I moved to Oregon, to again, small town, 5,000 population, Forest Grove. Small high school, maybe 300 kids. And my mom right away took me for an interview with the high school principal, again, small high school. First of all, he tested whether I spoke English well enough, and I did. And then he tested whether I knew some of the things they were teaching, like in math or geography, and I knew those. So he allowed me to skip 8th grade and start as a freshman. Freshman year was tough on me. First of all, I'd been in the country only a year and a half, so I still didn't understand or feel American culture. And I kept making mistakes, not as bad as what I did in North Carolina, but embarrassing. And then I knew right away that I was embarrassed because I already spoke it well enough. Number two, I had a very heavy Polish accent. And I was the only kid in the room in the high school that had an accent, so that was embarrassing. Worst of all, I started stuttering very badly. I could never speak to a group like you or even one or two people without stuttering. And I think it's because the memories of the Holocaust started to register in my head. 4 years later, when I graduated, I lost most of my Polish accent. I lost most of my stuttering. During the summers, I did everything the kids do. We all worked for pocket money. So first we worked in the fields, picking strawberries or picking beans. Never made much money picking strawberries because I love them, so I was eating too many of them instead of putting them in the basket. I did okay picking beans when I got, after my junior or senior year, I worked on sawmills because I was already big enough and strong enough to heft some boards. Something happened to me in my junior year that I want to share with you. Because if something like that ever happens to you guys, at least maybe what I will tell you will help you. In the beginning, okay, this town, Forest Grove, was mostly farming and logging and sawmill operations. So most of the families worked in that area. And early in the junior year, a vocational counselor came to our school to help us guide, give us advice, what to do during the next these 2 years of the junior and the senior year, what courses to take, depending on what we plan to do afterwards. Like about half the kids went to one of the local colleges. So what should they be taking? Or should they be going to trade school? Or are they going to work on the parents' farms or work in the forest logging? So the vocational counselor's job was to help us plan the next 2 years. When it was my turn, he asked me what I planned to do, and I said, ever since then, I wanted something to do with airplanes. When I knew that aeronautical engineers built and design and build airplanes, I said, I want to be an aeronautical engineer. And he said to me, well, you're probably not smart enough to be an aeronautical engineer, but you'll be a really good car mechanic. Now, I love cars. When I bought my first used car when I was in college, with the money that I saved working summers, was a used car, and when it kept breaking down, I learned how to fix it myself because I couldn't afford to pay anybody to fix it. And I still occasionally work on my cars. I love cars. But I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. And I remember thinking, why is he discouraging me? By that time, I already learned enough about this, the American dream, that is essentially that if you really want to get somewhere in your life, regardless of what your family background is, and I consider myself an immigrant at that time, because I was, but regardless of what your family background is, if you're willing to work hard to get there, you can get there. Doesn't matter what your family background is, and I believe that. So I thought, why is he discouraging me? Yes, I'm an immigrant, but why is he discouraging me? And then it occurred to me that he's probably discouraging me because he got discouraged himself. And I'm telling you guys this because if somebody tries to discourage you from something that you want to do in your life, and you're willing to work hard for it, don't let them. Don't let them. Go for it. But work hard. And that interview made me actually angry. So until then, I was getting A's and B's and some C's occasionally because I wasn't studying very hard. After that interview, I knew I had to work hard. So I started studying much harder, and from then on, I got straight A's. And at the end, somewhere in my senior year, I went to my math teacher because I liked him, and I asked him what's a good university for aeronautical engineering, and he said, well, the best one is MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So I said, okay, I'll apply there. I was very naive or very stupid. That was the only school I applied to. But I was also very lucky, and I got in. And altogether, over the next dozen years, I spent 8.5 of those dozen years at MIT. I got 4 degrees in engineering, including a PhD. And afterwards, I worked in the aerospace industry, designed rocket engines. The lunar excursion module, which lowered our Apollo astronauts to the surface of the moon, it was a variable thrust engine. I helped design that. I was on that team. Then for 25 years, I commuted between California and Moscow, trading with the Russians. But all through that time, all through those 50 years, I kept Holocaust at an emotional distance. I never talked about it. People didn't know what I went through, didn't know anything about what I just told you guys about, because I kept it at emotional distance. I saw what it did to my mom. My mom was very smart, and she was a very successful businesswoman here in America, but she was haunted by the Holocaust till her dying day. And I didn't want that to happen. And then 9 years ago, I had a realization that my story had value. It was because of this small town in Tennessee. I had that realization that my story has value. So my wife asked me probably for the 25th time or whatever, whether I would write my story. She's been encouraging me to write it, and I always said no. After that realization, I surprised her, and I surprised myself, and I said, yeah, I'll do it. I started the next day. I finished it 3 months later. Oh yeah, if we have time, ask me about the 1939 Warsaw phone book. It got me back to Poland 4 years ago. I surprised myself, I surprised her. I started the next day, started writing the next day. 3 months later, I wrote my book, Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows, 2010. I was interviewed by a journalist in San Francisco, because she learned that she learned that I was published the book. I guess friends asked me to have a hard copy, so I put it on Amazon also. But I first put it on free access website, scribe.com. On scribe.com, you can read it for free. You can print it on your printer for free. Actually, one of the schools I speak, every year they have several foreign groups coming in for a kind of a summit, global teen summit they call it, and there's a Chinese delegation and Polish delegation there, like between 6 and 12 students and a couple of teachers, and one of the years, so I've been speaking there every year for the last 10 years, and one of the Chinese students got inspired, and he translated my book into Chinese and put it on the free access website. So on scribe.com, there's both an English version and a Chinese version. We'll be taking some photographs because right before my very first talk at school, and I've done about over 200 talks by now in the last 9 years. This is probably number 212. This journalist from a newspaper asked me whether I have a website, and I said no. Why? She said, well, the kids will ask interesting questions, so you should have a website. So their questions and your answers should be on the website. So I decided to make the website interesting. The photos that we'll be taking here, those will be on the website. If you have permission, from your parents to have photographs taken, those will be on the website, including, like you guys want to have any selfies, those will be on the website. My answers and your questions will be on the website. Anyway, I've done this 200 and some times, and the reason I'm here with you guys is because you guys are old enough to understand what I lived through, what I survived, but yet you're young enough to have an open mind, to decide for yourself whether you want to lead your life on the side of fairness and truth and tolerance, or on the side of hatred and anger. You might have had to make the choice already. If you're ever walking somewhere in school or somewhere else and you saw somebody being bullied, what did you do? Did you face the bully and say to them, stop it? Or did you keep walking and let the bullying continue? That was a choice you made. Later on, depending on where you live, you might have tougher choices. You might see mob actions, beatings, maybe even killings. It's happening in parts of the world right now. I hope you guys always, always choose the side of fairness and truth and tolerance. I very much hope you do that. That's why I came here. Thank you.
So we're going to open it up for some questions, and Mr. Elbaum will answer all of your questions if anyone wants to start off.
And then after that, I wanted to shot with the whole group.
100%.
Good, okay. Okay.
What's the backstory to the title? Like, what made you come up with Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows?
Oh, you mean that title? Good question, thank you. The reason for Neither Yesterdays Nor Tomorrows is that during the war, the families that kept me, I'm very grateful for that because they saved me, but they weren't always nice to me. So maybe for my psychological well-being, maybe by instinct, I learned to forget bad things from the past. I really forget them. To this day, something bad happens, I don't remember it for very long. I remember good things. And for example, in hang gliding, I crashed half a dozen times, and every time I knew I was going to hit the hill. I remember everything, including hitting the hill. But when I got hurt, when I got knocked unconscious, between the moment I was going to hit the hill, the moment I knew I was going to hit the hill, and the time I did hit it, it had to be at least several seconds, because probably when I was only about 20, 30 feet off the ground, I knew I was going to hit the hill. I don't remember that. Totally blanked it out. So, and to this day, I blank out bad stuff. So that's why neither yesterdays. That's why I didn't want to go back to Poland, because Poland wasn't very nice to me. And nor tomorrows, because I learned not to think to the future, because I never knew when I would see my mom or whether. And again, to this day, I don't look to the future. I don't plan. It drives people crazy. It drives my wife crazy. And I know that in business, it helps to plan. I don't plan, but I've done okay. And that's why neither yesterdays nor tomorrows. Does that answer your question? Yeah, it does. Thank you. Good.
Anyone else have a question? So when did you know and accept your Jewish heritage?
When did I know that I was Jewish?
Yeah.
Another good question. During the war, I didn't. I mean, I was raised by these families, the Catholic families, and I would do what the kids do. I prayed with them. I remember the first time, until then I never prayed. So the first time I was with a Catholic family, the kids were praying. So I asked them, well, why do you pray? And they said, well, because we're told to pray, and if we don't, we get a beating, or if we do pray, we get better food. I said, okay, I'll pray with you. So then after the war, I thought I was a Catholic, but there was no religion in Poland. It was a communist country. So I was raised without any religious training. But one of the first few months, probably like the summer of 1945, so war ended in like January in 45. And sometimes that summer, because I remember it was a warm or hot day, a couple of us were playing in the courtyard, and one of the kids called somebody a dirty Jew. And I'm politically very liberal now, and I'm liberal in many ways. And apparently I was liberal at that time, and I said to him, well, wait a minute. There are good Jews and bad Jews, and there are good Poles and bad Poles. I said, you and I are good Poles, but there are also bad Poles too. And he didn't agree with me. He kept saying, no, all Jews are bad. I disagreed with him. We started arguing. We got into a fist fight. He got bloody, and I got bloody. And my mom heard about it, and she decided that was a good time to tell me that I was Jewish. I didn't want to be Jewish. By that time, I already knew what happened to Jews during the war, and I didn't want that burden. I started bawling. I started crying, because I was willing to defend Jews, but I didn't want to be one. I got over it, and actually nothing makes me feel, I'm still not religious, because I had no religious training either. After the war, there was no religion at all in Poland, communist. After the war, and after we came to America, we were the only Jews in the town. My mom never wanted me to be religious, but the only thing that my mom wanted me, and she raised me that way, is to believe in the golden rule, which is to treat others as you would like them to treat you. And I do follow that. I truly follow that religiously. And there's nothing I've done that I'm ashamed of. I follow the golden rule. Thank you.
How do you feel about what is happening today in America with immigrants and the proposal of the wall being built?
With immigrants and what?
The proposal of the wall being built?
The proposal?
The wall.
Oh, yeah. I can't believe it. America is a country of immigrants. There isn't a single person here in this room whose either parents or grandparents or great-grandparents didn't come to America as immigrants. That's why I can't believe this is happening. I mean, I consider myself an immigrant, although when I'm asked by Polish kids, do I consider myself Polish or American, I'm 100% American. I believe in everything that America does. It doesn't mean America does everything well. America can be better, and this is a good example of where America can be better. But I can't believe that the President of the United States tells a country of immigrants that we have to fear immigrants. I can't believe that. And as a matter of fact, when I am in Poland, I speak every year for the last 3-4 years. I spent a week in Poland speaking to Polish schools, high schools. And I speak in English because I forgot Polish. It took me only about 2-3 years to forget Polish, my native language. And it's again, I think it's a matter of forgetting. I forgot Polish, I think, psychologically, because Poland is something that was bad to me. And when they ask me in Poland, why is it that our administration talks down on immigrants? I tell them, I don't understand it. It embarrasses me. I'm ashamed of America.
Did you feel a sense of like comfort when you started to tell your story for the first time?
Did I feel comfort when I started what?
To tell your story.
Oh. Yeah, I've been asked that question because I've been asked whether there's any release. No, because I don't think I felt anything. I didn't feel I was holding anything back. Again, maybe it's a matter of not looking back, not letting bad memories stop me or affect me. I truly focus on the moment, on whatever I'm doing. It turns out I've got a very good ability to focus on my task at hand. And I believe in a problem that's going to come up tomorrow. I'll tackle that tomorrow. I will share this with you. When I was writing the book, writing wasn't difficult for me because I was very focused on writing, which is a very active process. I was doing something. I first thought of what memories I had, and each one became a chapter, and I was writing each chapter. New memories came up, so I added chapters. And that went smoothly. But the first time I had a rough draft, and I was trying to edit it, reading the whole thing. Reading is a lot more passive than writing. And when I was reading it for the first time, my heart was at my throat half the time. That was difficult. And sometimes when I speak, including once or twice today, I felt a lump in my throat, because it still hurts a little bit. But it's worth it. It's worth it for me to do this.
Did living in the Holocaust make you question your faith in God, or did it make it stronger?
Neither. At the age of 4 and 5 and 6, just like the other kids, we were doing what we were told. So the concept of God didn't occur to me, and it didn't occur, not so much occur, just they didn't understand it and I didn't understand it, because it was never explained to us. So we prayed by rote, by remote control almost. We did what we were told. So to this day, I neither believe in God nor do I deny God. I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know, and I don't think anybody is. But I lead my life in such a way that, whether it's by Western religion or Jewish religion, I studied religions. There's no religion that that would consider me immoral. So I think I'm religious without believing pro or con in God.
What were your first thoughts of America when you arrived?
When I arrived, my first thoughts? Well, let me back it up a little bit. Before I arrived in Poland, America was kind of like the shining light. It's almost like heaven on earth. You know, in Poland, we would see these beautiful American cars that were part of the embassy staff. Because of my mom's position as an executive in this government publishing house, she was also assigned an apartment on this beautiful street. Right across from us was the American embassy. A block down was the Soviet embassy. And the American embassy had these gorgeous, big, shining cars. I love cars. I love to look at them. We thought not just I, but all the other kids, we know 7, 8, 9, 10, we thought that everything's good in America. You know, as a matter of fact, I'll share this with you. In Russia, during the communist era, the government was trying to keep religion down, and Russians are, you know, Eastern Orthodox, and they're religious. And so only the old people would go to church regularly because the government was trying to discourage young people from going. And on their main holidays like Easter, the young people wanted to go to church also because their parents would want them to go. And the Russian government, or the Soviet government, was very insidious in how they kept the young people from going to church. Instead of showing the usual Soviet movies that were on television, which were crappy, they were phony, nobody liked them, but they're very propaganda. During the Easter holidays and in the other major holidays, the Russian government, the Soviet government, would show good American films on television because they knew that the youth would stay home to watch them. So this is how communist government prevented religion in young people. Now, tell me your question again. I kind of slid. Yeah.
I said, what were your first thoughts of America?
Oh yeah, good. Okay, so there we go. I'll get back to this. So beautiful cars, you know, food. We knew those people that had relatives abroad would get these packages of Goodwill type packages. We even, again, this is how the communist government tried to discourage people from thinking that the West was good. Trolley cars. In Warsaw streets, there were these crappy-looking, plywood-bodied trolleys. But the propaganda was that they had very good, strong engines, whereas the new trolleys that they bought in France and in America, beautiful metal bodies. Yeah, but they have weak engines, you know, so just lies all over the place. But most of us that were, you know, like even at the age of 9, see, I came over here when I was 11, but even at the age of 8, 9, and 10, we started to see through some of those lies. So I looked forward to everything in America. I thought that nothing in America is bad. And I'll tell you 2 instances that were surprising to me. One was trite, the other one is not trite. The trite one was when I was in France. We went from America to France. I was there for that almost a year, and then to America. And in France, I heard about Coca-Cola, that is the most popular drink in America. And I love fruit drinks. So I thought, wow, if Coca-Cola is popular in America, it must be something fantastic. At that time, there was no Coca-Cola in France yet. That was, like I said, in 1949. So I came to America, and my first day, I wanted a Coca-Cola. I was so disappointed, like, ugh. That was a trite one. The one that wasn't so trite was in North Carolina. There were this little town where we lived was 20 miles each side of it. It was a larger town, like maybe 20,000 in each one. And at one point, shortly after we arrived, it was something that my mom had to do that was official, and she needed to do something in one part of town. And she gave me the money to pay for the bus to take 5 stops. I think it was 5 stops on the bus. And to get off at the 5th stop, it told me where to go. So I got on the bus, and most of the front seats were busy, but I saw way in the back, things were empty. So I went all the way to the back of the bus and just sat there just to feel free, I suppose. And then the bus driver, yelled something. I didn't speak English, so I was ignoring it. And he finally turned around, and I could tell he was looking at me and kind of motioning me and was yelling at me. I didn't know what he was talking about. So he stopped the bus completely, came back, and was berating me, but I didn't understand. So finally I just said, no English, no English. That part I knew, no English. He picked me up by my armpits, carried me to the front, and plopped me down in the front row. And I didn't understand it. So I asked my mom about it, and she told me the segregation in this America. And I thought, well, wait a minute, America is democratic. How could there be, kind of a segregation between citizens? I couldn't understand that. That was a big disappointment for me.
What can our generation do to ensure nothing like the Holocaust ever happens again?
Well, being a realist, I don't think we can do anything that will prevent it ever happening again. I think Holocaust and hatred and us versus them is part of human nature. Archaeology and history, particularly ancient archaeology, is a hobby for me. And I realized there was, one time when I was in college, on my own, I spent all night reading a book that described the major archaeological discoveries in the world. And one of them was the discovery of clay tablets that were saved from the library at Persepolis in Persia. And at that time, most people didn't write, but there were scribes. And the ruler, the king, was dictating the scribe. The scribe was using these little clay tablets. And he was describing how he keeps his nobles in check. Because the power, there was no voting certainly, so common people didn't matter. The nobles could be a danger to the king. So he was describing how he keeps them in check. And it was nothing different than what today's politicians do. Pure PR, pure political sloganism, they're bad, we got to, not too different from what we hear from our administration right now. And I thought, okay, that was written right around 1000 or 500 BC. So 2,500 years later, politicians are no different. And probably civilization, when it started 8,000 years ago in places like Sumer or Ur, cities in Mesopotamia, people were no different then. So I don't think there's anything that we can change. Human nature changes only at the speed of evolution. That's pretty slow. 8,000 years didn't change human beings very much, but what we can do, and I do this, and I hope you guys will do it. When you see something that's prejudice or hatred, racial, religious, whatever, face the bully and say that out loud. I want to hear you say it. Most of the time, they're going to back up because prejudice, racial hatred, religious hatred, it grows only in darkness. Sunlight, visibility exposes it. People are ashamed if they're pointed. Not all of them. Some will admit it. But I say what we individually can do is when we see bullying, when we see hatred, religious or any sort, ask them to speak louder. I didn't hear you well enough. Tell me again. They'll back off. If they don't, that's all you can do. But do it, please. Do it, please.
How was your high school experience like when you got to America?
What was my high school experience?
Yeah.
You mean, oh,
Like as a student.
yeah. Well, the problem was that the high school was not a very good high school. It was small. The science teacher was also a football coach, and he was a much better coach than he was a science teacher, and we lost most of the games, most of the football games, so he wasn't a very good coach either. I was too small to play football. I wrestled. It was, I guess the friends that I had in high school were mostly what I would consider outcasts, because they were interested in science. I was interested in science. I was interested in flying. And I don't think I fitted in very well. But maybe that's what kind of led me to leading a relatively solitary life with my wife. We've been married 45 years. Each year is happier than the next, so we're lucky. I'll say this, I've had 3 major strokes of luck in my life. 1 is surviving the Holocaust, 2, coming to America, and 3, meeting my wife. And with those 3 pieces of luck, for everything else I worked, but those 3 luck. And my wife and I live in a little bubble. Yeah, I'm active in a couple of universities, including MIT. I'm on a number of committees. I got one meeting this weekend. I got 3 or 4 meetings, MIT committee meetings next week. Then I go home to San Francisco. So I'm active in that. I'm active in another university, scientific. But other than that, my wife and I lead a very solitary life. We have 1 son. He lives in Seattle. He's 50 years old. So yeah, I was 30 when he was born. But yeah, probably by nature, because I didn't fit. Again, I had an accent in high school. I still didn't understand many of the things. I didn't play football. I hated baseball for different reasons. But anyway, yeah, it probably made me more of a solitary person than if I had been social. I'm not social.
So we're out of time for the questions at this point, but I want to call up Lauren and Liv to present Mr. Elbaum with a little gift from Stoughton High School, and then we can take some pictures. And if any of you have any individual questions that you want to ask, you can come on down and do that.
Let me just put this away so it doesn't blow away.
On behalf of Stoughton High School, we would like to thank you for speaking to us today. We admire your generosity in coming to share your story. We have been inspired by your bravery and courage. As students have taken the Holocaust class this year, it has truly been a privilege to have the opportunity to hear from someone who experienced this dark time in history. As a token of our appreciation, we would like to present you with this gift to thank you for taking the time out of your day to speak with us.
In addition to this, I want a hug. One. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.